the Jewish Channel's Week in Review. The Iran nuclear deal is set to be authorized by the United States. How the reform movement will be preying on these high holidays, a new musical for a new Jewish year, and more of the Jewish news that's changing your world right now in this episode of the Week in Review. Hello, and welcome to the Jewish Channel's Week in Review. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. It's done. The Iran nuclear deal has the votes it needs in the Senate to avoid a veto override of a statement of disapproval, and may even have enough to filibuster any vote against it. The United States will certify the Iran nuclear deal alongside the United Nations, European Union, and other signatories and oversight groups. The deal also has a sizable majority of Jewish lawmakers backing it in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. 18 have announced their support for the deal, while only 9 had announced they are opposed, with only 1 having not yet made a decision as we went to air this week. In the Senate, the result is even more lopsided, where 7 Jewish senators have said they support the deal, compared to only 2 opposed. Barring any surprises, then, the Iran nuclear deal will face no hurdles it can't get past and will become the law of the United States in the coming days. Meanwhile, in Israel and Palestine, the threat of Jewish terrorism continues to rear its head. A third member of the Dawabsha family has died. The Palestinian family, burned in an arson attack on their home in the West Bank, had lost a baby and the family's father. The mother, Reham Dawabsha, is now dead as well. The only surviving member of the family is the still hospitalized 4-year-old Ahmed. While 2 Jewish men from the West Bank have been placed under administrative detention, no one has yet been charged with any level of involvement in this attack. 2 Jewish men have been indicted, however, in the case of an arson attack against a Bedouin family. 19-year-old Avi Gafni and a minor were charged on several counts for burning the tent near Ramallah last month. No one was injured in the attack because the family had temporarily left the tent due to extreme heat. And discrimination against black Jews continues to rile in the Jewish state. Israel's Attorney General has dropped charges against the white Israeli police officer who beat a black Israeli soldier that was caught on camera earlier in the summer and led to large protests and the personal involvement of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The reported reason for the charges being dropped was a lack of, quote, public interest. A new video of a police officer tasering a black Israeli after speaking to him for a few seconds has ignited outrage from the black community as well. The combination of these 2 events has led to renewed protests from Israel's so-called Ethiopian Jewish population. And the ultra-Orthodox man who stabbed 7 people at Jerusalem's Gay Pride Parade in July, killing one of them, has been charged with murder and 6 charges of attempted murder. This would be the second time Yishai Schlissel is charged with attempted murder after he wounded 3 people in the parade in 2005 and served 10 years in jail before being released 3 weeks before this year's parade. 11 members of Israel's police force were disciplined for failing to protect the parade. On the topic of being punished for one's actions, there's a new take on the high holidays this year from the Reform Movement, which has published a new set of prayer books for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Rebecca Honig Friedman reports.
At Temple Israel on Manhattan's Upper East Side, Rabbi David Gelfand is more excited than he's ever been about the high holidays. That's because the Reform Movement has published the Mishkan HaNefesh Machzor for the Days of Awe, a brand new prayer book for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur.
This is the best prayer book I've ever seen of any kind. And I mean any kind, Jewish, non-Jewish, Orthodox, Conservative, Reform.
Temple Israel is one of about 300 congregations that will be using the new Machzors, which were published by the Reform Movement's Central Conference of American Rabbis, or CCAR Press.
We really thought it's time to create a Machzor for the 21st century.
Rabbi Hara Person oversaw the creation of Mishkan HaNefesh, which replaces the Gates of Repentance prayer book as the Reform Movement's new liturgical standard. Gates of Repentance was originally published in 1978 and was adapted from a British prayer book.
There was not an authentic, sort of organic North American Machzor that had been created by the community for the community since the 1890s.
So rather than simply updating Gates of Repentance, Rabbi Person and her team started from the ground up to reflect and address the wide diversity among today's Reform Movement's constituents, she said.
Who are we today as a community? How do we understand who we are, and who are we becoming? Who are we going to be in the next generation? And we need to create a Machzor that really fits that.
Mishkan HaNefesh is the first Reform High Holidays Machzor to feature transliteration of the Hebrew text, to help those who cannot read Hebrew to pronounce the words. That alone makes for a more inclusive experience, said Temple Israel's cantor Arina Altshul, who has run some pilot services with early versions of the prayer book.
Just that everyone can participate. I think that for many people it was one of the keys.
Mishkan HaNefesh also includes modern translations and updated language to be more inclusive of the LGBT population. For example, the blessing to call someone up to the Torah now offers an option for language that is gender neutral, an inclusive way to call up transgender congregants or others who do not wish to be identified as a particular gender. But what makes the Machzor particularly exciting to congregational leaders is its inclusion of alternative ways to engage congregants who might not connect with traditional prayer.
We can't assume that everyone's coming in with one approach, sort of personal approach to theology, faith, belief, God.
Rabbi Person cited the treatment of Unatana Tokef as an example.
Some people find it that sort of beautiful touchstone, like it's not Rosh Hashanah if we don't have that. But for some people, it really presents a challenge. And so we've created framing pieces for that. So here are some ways to think about it. Here are ways that other people have struggled with it, and here are some of their thoughts about it. Here's some historical background to it. We've also added poetry and alternative translations. Again, that things that go to the themes of the traditional liturgy, but offer a different way in for somebody for whom the prayer may not really open that door.
For more on the Reform Movement's new High Holidays prayer books, watch the full broadcast version of the Week in Review. Wishing you a very happy and sweet new year, no matter which prayer book you use. For the Jewish Channel, I'm Rebecca Honig Friedman.
Thank you, Rebecca. While the High Holidays brings with it a spirit of renewal, Meredith Ganzman reports on a revival of a famous Broadway musical in a segment for our theater show, Row J.
From the upcoming Broadway musical revival of Spring Awakening, which is based on the 1891 play by Frank Wiedekind, a coming-of-age story of teenagers discovering their sexuality.
I don't think truly that this is your typical revival. It's not just doing the show again in a fun or even just interesting way. It's an entirely new story.
Austin McKenzie plays one of the teenagers, Melchior Gabor. Unlike in the original 2007 Tony Award-winning Best Musical Production, in the current revival, many of the cast members and the characters they play are deaf. The revival sets the musical in the time after the 1880 Milan Conference, the first international conference of deaf educators in Milan, Italy, in which a declaration was made that oral education was better than manual sign language, banning the use of sign language in schools. Deaf students were stripped of their language, director Michael Arden explained.
It was a really dark time in deaf culture.
In the revival, many of the actors are deaf. Some will never hear the award-winning music by Duncan Sheik and Stephen Sater. While the use of sign language and the setting within the deaf community is new, the metaphor of deafness has always been at the heart of the story. Book writer Stephen Sater says,
"It's always been about a culture that's deaf to what's going on in the hearts and minds of its young people. To see that brought forth, to see the words turned into movement, words I wrote, in the privacy of my own heart, and to see them danced in front of people and made into gesture. It's really evocative. It's really affecting for me.
When you are deaf, you only have your body and your face to express yourself. And so you are performing at all times. And when I watch them move, there's such inner beauty and you see right into their souls.
Deaf West's last Broadway production was 2003's Big River. This new revival of Spring Awakening will bring American Sign Language back to Broadway.
American Sign Language is a very popular language right now. It's one of the top languages being learned in the world today. So for people to see it, actually witness it on stage, is going to be incredible.
And it's so exciting for deaf audiences who so much of the time have to look to the sidelines. And they actually get to look at the stage and watch characters. And I think with theater it's best when an audience can look to the stage and say, hey, that's me up there. I understand who that person is.
Spring Awakening begins performances on Broadway on September 8th with a limited run through January 9th at the Brooks Atkinson Theater. For more on the new Broadway revival of Spring Awakening, tune into the full broadcast version of The Week in Review.
Thank you, Meredith. Finally, this week on Up Close, we often close ourselves off from information and experiences that can help us and ignore the opportunities right under our noses. We're also ignoring the danger that might lurk in areas we've walled off from our concern. Information hidden in silos can be vital. That's the argument of Financial Times U.S. Managing Editor Gillian Tett, author of The Silo Effect, The Peril of Expertise, and the Promise of Breaking Down Barriers. And sometimes new experiences and new acquaintances can teach us how to be the people we'll become. That's a theme in the novel by New York Times Deputy Washington Editor Jonathan Weisman, Number 4 Imperial Lane. Here are some of the highlights from my interview with Jonathan Weisman. One of the things that your novel does really well is weave together these themes of nations with the theme of life and what it means to be a character going through all of this, not just being a member of a country that's going through much upheaval, but the idea that we're all going through a lot of upheaval.
We all have a past that needs to be confronted. And I talked about, obviously, some people might talk about an American empire, but not in the same sense as the British Empire or the Portuguese Empire. But I have this Jewish American character, David Heller, and he too, at the beginning of the novel, he can't look at his past. He has his own tragedy back in America that he can't confront. And over the course of the book and learning the story of the people he's living with and their own tragedies, and thinking about how do you move forward, he learns to look back at his past and to grapple with why he won't go home.
For some other characters you have here, these former aristocrats, or I guess current aristocrats, you tell me.
I would call them former, I guess, if they're down to a few pieces of furniture.
A daughter raised perhaps too soft in a number of ways to live well in the world, and a son raised with too much incentive for adventure to live well in the world. And it makes you think about all the various ways maybe we're screwing up our children, maybe we were screwed up as children.
That is a good point, because Hans, this is a guy who had all license to do anything he wanted. His father is he was in the House of Lords. He drops his title to go to the House of Commons because he has to have one last political fight to save fox hunting. And his son, his kind of man about town, ne'er-do-well son, he's got all sorts of license because he knows that the trust fund is always there, and when it's time, he'll shape himself up, come back, take over his father's peerage and his father's estate, and everything will be fine. So yes, he doesn't learn any sense of responsibility because he knows that why bother? It's going to be there for me anyway. And his sister Elizabeth, who's kind of the black sheep of the family, only because she wasn't a beautiful woman. She didn't particularly have any need to be trained in the world, and her mother sequesters her on the estate, and her only education is through tutors, and all those tutors do is teach her Shakespeare.
Then within all of that, there's this idea of time and how quickly things can change, and how you can be surprised by how little time has passed to make something what it is. But then at the same time, we're talking about some of these changes here that take centuries to make.
I tried to maintain that parallel between the individual characters and kind of the nations, the lifespan of nations. And you're right. I mean, you can say that given the circumstances, given very adverse circumstances, most people will rise to the occasion and make the changes they will.
You can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish Channel on cable. You can also listen to the full audio of Up Close as a podcast, available on iTunes or in your favorite podcast player. That's all for this week. From all of us here at the Jewish Channel, be well. The Jewish Channel is available on cable. Time Warner Cable Channel 1640, Iowa Uplink Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Cox Cable Channel 1, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, and on Comcast on the on-demand menu on premium channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.